Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to follow one perfect afternoon when a simple supermarket trip turns into laughter in the kitchen, smoke rising from the grill, and a quiet barbecue that makes two hearts realize happiness might be as simple as choosing, cooking, and sharing life together. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The shopping cart rolls softly over the cool supermarket tiles, its wheels making that steady, quiet sound that somehow made the whole afternoon feel calmer than it really was. White light stretched across the ceiling, reflecting off polished floors and long rows of shelves packed with everything from fresh herbs to bottled sauces, snack bags, fruit crates, and tall stacks of charcoal near the seasonal display. It should have felt ordinary, just two people shopping for food. But somehow, with the two of them side by side, it didn't feel ordinary at all. He pushed the cart with one hand, moving slowly, not because the aisles were crowded, but because there was no need to rush. She walked close beside him, glancing from shelf to shelf, occasionally leaning in to inspect something, occasionally pretending not to smile when she caught him watching her do it. They reached for the same pack of fresh beef at the exact same time. Their fingers brushed. She pulled her hand back first, then looked up and gave him a quick, teasing smile. "You always go for the biggest one," she said. "That's because I know what good meat looks like." "Oh, really?" "Yes," he said seriously, lifting the pack to inspect it as if this were a matter of enormous importance. "I'm carrying the responsibility of this entire barbecue." She laughed softly and shook her head. "That sounds dramatic. I prefer committed." She rolled her eyes, but the smile stayed. They moved on, and at the vegetable section, she wrinkled her nose the moment he picked up onions. "No." He looked at her. "No, what?" "No onions." He lifted one in front of her face like evidence in a trial. "Onions are not optional. They smell too strong. They make everything better." She leaned in closer and lowered her voice as if negotiating a secret. "Then buy fewer." Instead of arguing, he quietly placed 2 into the cart instead of 4. She noticed. Of course she noticed. And because she was not about to let him think he had won too easily, she picked up an extra bunch of spinach and dropped it into the basket with exaggerated confidence. He looked down. "What's that for?" "You," she said. "You need to get greener." He stared at her for a second, as if deciding whether to defend himself or laugh. Then he laughed. The sound came easily, warm and low, and it made her feel strangely pleased with herself. They continued through the produce aisle like that, half shopping, half teasing, the cart growing heavier as their steps somehow grew lighter. At the fruit section, he chose deep red grapes, holding the bunch up to the light with unnecessary seriousness. She pretended to disapprove. "Those are too expensive." "You say that now," he replied, "but when you start eating them later, you'll forget the price." She made a face. Then, while he was distracted comparing 2 packs of mushrooms, she slipped a container of strawberries into the cart. He spotted it instantly. "Excuse me," he said, turning toward her. "What's this?" She tried to keep her face innocent and failed completely. Her eyes were already sparkling. "You like strawberries," she said. "So do you." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" She shrugged lightly. "Maybe I wanted them." He narrowed his eyes in mock suspicion, then placed the grapes beside the strawberries with exaggerated care. "Fine. But now, this is officially a joint decision." Somewhere between the cold supermarket air, the bright fruit displays, and their small, ridiculous arguments over vegetables and prices, the afternoon began to feel quietly meaningful. Nothing dramatic was happening. No declarations, no big turning point. And yet the air between them felt alive in a way both of them noticed. Their shoulders brushed when they leaned over the freezer section. He held the cart still while she reached for corn. She slipped a package of marshmallows in at the last second, and when he found them, she looked away too quickly to pretend it hadn't been intentional. "You planned dessert and didn't tell me?" "I'm capable of independent thought." "That's getting dangerous." They smiled at each other for a second longer than necessary. Around them, the supermarket remained exactly what it had always been: crowded, bright, practical, full of people buying ordinary things for ordinary evenings. But inside that space, something else was taking shape, something small and quiet, like the early beginning of a fire beneath ash, not dramatic, not wild, just steadily warming everything around it. By the time they reached the checkout, the cart was full. Fresh beef, marinated chicken, pineapple, mushrooms, bell peppers, corn, spinach, grapes, strawberries, bread, sauce, charcoal, a bag of ice. And because she insisted they would definitely need them later, a box of napkins he had nearly forgotten. He loaded the bags into the car while she stood beside the trunk, holding the strawberries like they were somehow more fragile than the meat. "You know," he said, "for someone who claimed she only wanted a simple barbecue, you've made this surprisingly complicated." She looked at him over the top of the fruit container. "It's called being prepared. It's called buying half the supermarket." She smiled. "And yet you paid." He had no reply to that, so he only shut the trunk and laughed under his breath. By the time they got home, the afternoon sun had softened into something warmer, richer, almost golden. Light streamed through the kitchen window and stretched across the wooden counter in soft bands as they carried the groceries inside. The house still held that quiet midday stillness, but it changed the moment they entered together, like the walls themselves knew something good was about to happen. She took the vegetables to the sink and turned on the water. He set the meat on the counter and reached for a knife. Neither of them needed to discuss who would do what. Their movements found each other naturally. She rinsed greens beneath the running tap, fingers moving through the leaves with easy concentration. He sliced the pineapple into neat pieces, though every few moments his eyes drifted toward her again. At one point, the water splashed back and spotted the front of her shirt. She made a face. He saw it and smiled immediately. "What? You looked offended because the sink attacked me. That's dramatic." She flicked water at him in retaliation. A few cold drops landed on the back of his hand. He looked down, then back at her with theatrical disbelief. "You did that on purpose. And what if I did?" He pretended to dodge the next splash too late and let it hit him anyway, which made her laugh harder than it should have. The kitchen filled slowly with overlapping scents: fresh cut pineapple, rinsed greens, garlic crushed beneath the flat of a knife, rosemary, soy, pepper, smoke from charcoal drifting faintly in from the bags by the door. The room began to feel close in the best way, full of small sounds: the tap running, the knife against the cutting board, plastic containers clicking open, the occasional low burst of laughter when one of them made fun of the other. They reached for the spice jar at the same time. Again. Their hands touched and stayed there a second too long. Neither spoke. Then she smiled first, quiet and almost shy, and pulled back just enough for him to take the jar. He uncapped it and held it out to her. "After you." She seasoned the meat carefully, rubbing the marinade in with both hands. He stood behind her for just a moment, close enough that she could feel his warmth before she turned. When she struggled to reach one side of the tray, he stepped in, gently taking her wrist and guiding the motion. His breath brushed the back of her neck. Her heart skipped once, hard and sudden. The kitchen seemed to grow even smaller. When she tasted a bit of the marinade from the corner of a spoon, she grimaced. "Too salty? Maybe a little." He laughed, dipped his finger into the sauce, and tasted it himself. "You're right. You sound surprised. I was hoping you were wrong." She turned toward him with the kind of look that made him laugh again, and when a little bit of sauce caught near the corner of her mouth, he lifted his hand and wiped it away without thinking. The touch was light, tender, too natural to pretend it hadn't meant anything. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she looked down, suddenly very interested in the bowl of chopped herbs. He cleared his throat and rinsed the knife. They kept working after that, but the air had changed. It was still playful, still easy, still threaded with teasing remarks about who was clumsier with the vegetables or who was secretly adding too much garlic. But beneath all of it ran something steadier and more intimate. This was no longer just preparation. It was rhythm, cooperation, a kind of closeness built not from dramatic romance, but from tiny acts of care, repeated until they began to feel like a language. He washed the knife without being asked. She wiped the counter where he had left a mess of rosemary leaves. He moved the tray closer when she was reaching too far. She opened the drawer before he asked for the tongs. Neither of them said much about it. They didn't need to. By the time the marinated meat was ready and the fruit had been washed, cut, and set aside, they both paused at the counter and looked at what they had made together. The afternoon outside had turned warm and slow. The garden beyond the window glowed in late light. The grill still needed assembling. The charcoal still needed lighting. The first real smoke of the day had not even begun, and yet both of them could already feel it. Something about this afternoon was going to stay with them. By the time they carried everything outside, the light had changed completely. The sharp brightness of early afternoon had softened into gold, laying itself gently across the yard and turning the patch of green behind the house into something warmer, almost dreamlike. The grass looked newly alive under it. The leaves in the garden moved with a quiet rustling sound whenever the breeze passed through. It felt like the entire day had been preparing itself for this exact hour. He carried the grill out first. It was heavier than it looked, and he refused help in the stubborn way men sometimes do when they want to seem more capable than necessary. She followed behind him with the tray of marinated meat balanced carefully in both hands, plus the basket of fruit tucked against her hip. When he set the grill down in the middle of the small clearing, she placed everything on the wooden table nearby and stood back for a second, taking in the scene. "It actually looks nice," she said. He glanced around dramatically. "You sound surprised." "I am surprised. That's rude." She laughed softly and moved closer, the clean tablecloth shifting a little in the breeze as she spread the plates, bowls, and small containers of sauce across it. He crouched beside the grill and began fitting the pieces together. Metal clicked into place. Charcoal waited in a dark bag by his knee. The late afternoon air carried the scent of cut grass and warm soil, with just a trace of the marinade drifting from the tray each time the wind shifted. She watched him work for a moment longer than she meant to, smiling at the way concentration made him look both serious and slightly boyish at the same time. "You missed one," she said. He frowned and looked down. "No, I didn't." She stepped closer and pointed. "That bolt." He looked up at her, unwilling to admit it, then sighed. "Fine, I was testing you." "Sure you were." When the grill was finally assembled, he struck a match and held it to the edge of the kindling beneath the charcoal. The flame caught weakly at first, then strengthened, and both of them leaned in just a little, watching it with more interest than a small fire should probably deserve. When it finally took hold, they both smiled. Then, almost at the same moment, they laughed at themselves for it. "It's just fire," she said. "It's an important fire," he replied. "This fire decides our dinner." Smoke began rising in lazy white threads, twisting into the air before thinning toward the sky. She clapped once, quietly, in exaggerated approval, and he looked at her with open amusement. "You're celebrating early. I believe in encouraging the chef. You believe in supervising the chef." "That too." They drew closer as the coals heated, both standing near enough that their shoulders brushed now and then without either of them moving away. A little smoke drifted straight into her face and she blinked, turning her head with a soft cough. He grabbed a cardboard tray from the table and started fanning the air in front of her. "That is the least graceful rescue I've ever seen," she said, "but effective." She watched him for a moment while he continued fanning the smoke away from her with exaggerated seriousness. "Thank you," she said. He gave her a quick glance. "That sounded sincere. Are you all right? Don't get used to it." The first piece of meat hissed the second it hit the grill. Fat dripped onto the coals, and the smell rose instantly rich, smoky, sweet with marinade, carrying exactly the kind of promise that makes people suddenly feel hungrier than they were a minute before. They both inhaled at the same time and then looked at each other, which only made them laugh again. He took the tongs and turned the meat carefully, while she arranged vegetables on the side: corn, bell peppers, mushrooms, onions he had insisted on keeping, and even the extra spinach she had made fun of earlier. When the first slice looked ready, he cut off a small piece and held it toward her. "Well?" he asked. She leaned in and took the bite, chewing slowly with a face so serious that he immediately got suspicious. Then she frowned. "Too salty," she said. His expression fell so fast that she almost couldn't keep the joke going. Almost. He cut another piece, blew on it once, tasted it himself, and narrowed his eyes. "You're lying." She broke into laughter, and the sound of it scattered across the garden like something bright enough to change the air. "You should have seen your face," she said. "I trusted you. That was your first mistake." From then on, they fell into an easy rhythm. He grilled, she flipped vegetables. He fanned smoke away when it drifted too close. She nudged him with her elbow whenever one piece charred more than it should have. He pretended to be offended every time she questioned his timing. She pretended not to notice how often he passed her the best pieces first. At one point, she took the tongs from him and announced, "Move over. Clearly, this needs proper supervision." He stepped aside with exaggerated dignity. "I'm being replaced in my own barbecue. Only temporarily. That's how it starts." They were both laughing when a mushroom slipped from the grill and landed on the grass. She looked down at it, then up at him. "Master Chef," she said. He placed a hand over his chest. That one jumped. Smoke drifted around them like a thin curtain, making the whole garden feel strangely private, as if the rest of the world had been kept at a distance just for this one afternoon. The sounds of the road, the houses beyond the fence, even the occasional barking dog from somewhere farther off, all seemed muted by the small, warm world they had built around the coals. When the food was finally ready, they carried it all to the table. The plate steamed in the cooling air. The fruit sat bright and fresh beside the darker, smokier colors of the grilled meat and vegetables. He pulled out her chair without making a show of it. She noticed anyway. Their hands brushed when she sat down, and neither commented. They ate slowly, not because the food required slowness, but because neither of them wanted the afternoon to end too quickly. He used his chopsticks to place a perfectly seared piece of meat on her plate. She responded by handing him a grilled mushroom, then another slice of pineapple because she insisted it tasted better after the smoke. The birds in the trees behind them began their evening calls. The air cooled further. Smoke from the dying grill lingered in the yard, mixing with the scent of charcoal, grass, and whatever sweetness still clung to the marinade. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But even the silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like an absence of words. It felt full, easy, complete, almost tender in its own right. The kind of silence people grow into when they no longer feel the need to constantly explain themselves. At one point, she leaned lightly against his shoulder while reaching for the grapes. He shifted just enough to make it easier for her, then left his arm resting behind her chair as if it had always belonged there. When one grape slipped from the bowl, bounced once across the table, and fell into the grass, they both stared at it in surprise, before laughing far too hard for such a small thing. "I'm blaming the chef," she said. "The chef served it correctly. Then I'm blaming the table." He looked around. "That seems unfair." By the time the plates were almost empty, the sky had deepened into a soft mix of orange, violet, and blue. The grill had quieted to glowing embers. Shadows stretched longer across the yard. The whole garden seemed to exhale with them. Neither wanted to get up, so instead they moved to the grass. There was a soft mat already laid there from earlier, and they stretched out side by side, close enough that their shoulders touched. The earth beneath them still held a little warmth from the day. Above them, the first stars had begun appearing in the darkening sky. He turned his head to look at her. She was already looking up, one hand folded across her stomach, the other resting near his. Without speaking, he reached for it. She let him. Their fingers threaded together naturally. The wind moved through the leaves above them with a slow whisper. Somewhere nearby, the last faint glow of the charcoal flickered and faded. The whole day seemed to narrow into this grass, cooling air, joined hands, and the strange peace of knowing there was nowhere else they wanted to be. After a while, she began telling him a small story from when she was younger. Nothing important, just something half funny, half embarrassing about a family meal and a cooking mistake no one ever let her forget. He laughed at the right parts, added one of his own afterward, and then they drifted into the kind of talk people only have when darkness makes honesty easier. No grand declarations, no dramatic promises, just memories, teasing, quiet truth, and underneath all of it, something larger and steadier than either of them needed to name. Eventually, practical life returned the way it always does. The dishes still had to be cleaned. The table still had to be folded. The tools still had to be put away. So they rose together and moved through the final work of the evening, side by side. He carried the trays in. She folded the cloth. He scrubbed the grill under the porch light. She dried bowls and stacked them neatly. Once, she spilled a little rinse water and he made a show of scolding her, which lasted exactly 2 seconds before both of them were laughing again. By the time everything was clean and the garden had returned to stillness, the night had fully settled around the house. They stood together at the edge of the porch and looked back over the place where the afternoon had unfolded. The grill now quiet, the table cleared, the grass lying flat and peaceful under starlight. He slipped an arm around her shoulders. She leaned in without hesitation. For a moment, neither said anything. Then, very softly, she asked, "Do you think we'll do this again?" He looked down at her, smiling in the porch light. "I think," he said, "we'll do this as many times as we can." That answer pleased her more than she expected. They went inside hand in hand, carrying the warmth of smoke, food, laughter, and unspoken tenderness with them. Behind them, the door closed softly on a day made entirely of small things: shopping, chopping, grilling, cleaning, and yet somehow, because they had done all of it together, it felt complete enough to be remembered forever. What begins as a simple supermarket trip slowly turns into one of those rare, unforgettable afternoons that feel almost too perfect to be real. As they shop side by side, teasing each other over vegetables, fruit, and barbecue ingredients, the ordinary rhythm of choosing food becomes something warmer, more intimate. Back home, the closeness deepens in the kitchen as they wash greens, slice fruit, season meat, and laugh over tiny mistakes that somehow feel precious. When they carry everything outside, the afternoon softens into gold and the garden becomes the setting for a quiet, joyful barbecue filled with smoke, laughter, playful teasing, and shared bites of food. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything important does. They eat slowly, rest together under the evening sky, then clean up side by side, turning even the smallest chores into part of their shared happiness. By the end of the day, they understand something beautiful. Love does not always arrive in grand moments. Sometimes it grows quietly through simple afternoons spent entirely together.